And that's when I decided I'm going to murder my mother. I knew a week before she died I was going to kill her.
In the early 1970s, California became the scene of unimaginable horror. 6 young women, each with their own dreams and futures, vanished without a trace and fell prey to a deadly trap by a charming stranger. Their families were left in grief and unaware that a monster was living among them. The terror intensified when this same man turned his violent impulses on his own mother, as well as his grandparents and a family friend. He had committed murders so shockingly that they shattered the lives of everyone involved. Who could be capable of such brutal violence? What drove him to commit such heinous acts? This is the horrible story of Edmund Emil Kemper, also known as the co-ed killer. He is a name that still sends chills down the spine. Let's jump right into the story. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948 in Burbank, California. His father, Edmund Kemper II, had served in World War II, and young Edmund looked up to his father with great admiration. However, the relationship with his mother, Clarnell Strandberg, was far from loving. In fact, it was filled with tension and conflict. Clarnell was a dominating and controlling woman who created a very toxic environment at home. Edmund's father often compared their home life to a war zone, and this constant stress deeply affected Edmund. The complicated dynamic between his parents played a huge role in shaping his troubled future. His father used to joke that going on a suicide mission during the war would have been easier than living with Clarnell. She was highly critical, constantly putting her husband down and belittling him. She refused to show affection to Edmund, and she kept saying that it would make him weak or soft. In her harsh words, she would often tell young Edmund that no woman would ever love him. This ongoing emotional abuse left deep scars. Edmund grew up feeling unloved, unwanted, and isolated. He couldn't escape harsh criticism from his mother, which crushed his self-esteem and left him emotionally vulnerable. In 1957, his parents separated when Edmund was just 9 years old. The divorce ended a marriage that was filled with bitterness, but the damage was already done for Edmund. The toxic behavior of his mother had already shaped his feelings of worthlessness and set him on a dark path that would define the rest of his life. After his parents divorced, the life of Edmund Kemper took an even darker turn. His mother moved him and his sisters to Montana, while his father relocated to Los Angeles. Edmund hated this move, and his already strained relationship with his mother only worsened. The behavior of Clarnell became more toxic over time. Her drinking increased, and so did her constant criticism of Edmund. She made him feel worthless, which fueled the darkness growing inside him. As a young boy, Edmund started developing disturbing fantasies. His mind became filled with violent thoughts, which soon found their way into his playtime. One of the most disturbing examples of this was when he convinced his sister to play morbid games like gas chamber and electric chair. Edmund would pretend to die in these games and simulate his own execution. He also found a weird pleasure in injuring dolls of his sisters and ripped their heads off and tore them apart. For young Edmund, these twisted acts gave him an alarming sense of satisfaction, and they hinted at the dangerous path he was beginning to follow. As Edmund grew older, his behavior became more upsetting. The fantasies were no longer confined to his games, but they started creeping into his real life. At one point, Edmund became obsessed with his second-grade teacher. He stalked her with a knife which his father had given him as a gift. When his classmates teased him and asked why he didn't just kiss her, his response was chilling. "If I kiss her, I'd have to kill her first." By the time Edmund was 10 years old, his thirst for violence had only grown stronger. One of his earliest acts of cruelty involved the family cat. Out of jealousy, Edmund buried the cat alive because he believed his sisters loved the pet more than him. But that wasn't the end. After the cat died, he dug it up, decapitated it, and placed its head on a stick. He even kept some of its bones hidden in his closet. This wasn't just a disturbing fantasy anymore, but was a practical act to his dark thoughts. This brutal act was a clear sign of the horrors to come. Clarnell was terrified because of the growing instability of her son, and she began to worry about the safety of her other children. She was afraid he might hurt his sisters, so she forced Edmund to sleep in the basement and isolated him from the rest of the family. This further deepened the wedge between them. At 13, just like he had done before, Edmund killed another family pet in a gruesome manner. This time, he stabbed the animal to death. His violent tendencies were becoming out of control, and Clarnell didn't know how to handle the behavior of her son. By age 15, Edmund couldn't take the toxic environment at home any longer. He ran away to California to live with his father and hoped to escape his troubled life with his mother. But things didn't go as planned. His father had remarried and started a new family, and Edmund didn't fit in. His father quickly realized he couldn't deal with troubled behavior of Edmund and sent him back to live with Clarnell. However, his return to his mother's house was brief. He was soon sent away again and was moving between relatives and institutions. He never found the stability or support he needed. Each rejection pushed him deeper into darkness, and his violent fantasies grew stronger. After being rejected by his father, 15-year-old Edmund Kemper was sent to live with his paternal grandparents on their 17-acre ranch in North Fork, California. By now, Edmund was a towering figure standing 6 feet and 4 inches tall and weighing around 250 pounds. But despite his size, he was still deeply troubled. Again, living with his grandparents didn't help. On August 27, 1964, what started as an ordinary afternoon would soon turn into a day of horror. Edmund's grandfather, Edmund I, had taken the family truck to town for shopping. Meanwhile, his grandmother, who was a children's book author, was sitting at the kitchen table working on her writing. Edmund sat nearby, stewing in anger from their latest argument. Unable to control his rage, Edmund grabbed his rifle, which was a gift from his grandfather, and meant for hunting small animals around the farm. He told his grandmother he was going outside to shoot ground squirrels, but instead he turned back toward her. With Maud's back to him, Edmund felt a dark urge to shoot her. He aimed the rifle at her head and pulled the trigger. Maud slumped forward onto the table, and she was dead from the shot. But the anger of Edmund wasn't finished. He fired 2 more shots into her back to make sure she was gone. Afterward, he dragged her lifeless body to the bedroom and tried to hide what he had done by covering her head with a towel. Not long after, his grandfather returned from the store and was completely unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded. As he unloaded groceries from the truck, Edmund took his chance. He shot his grandfather and killed him instantly. As groceries hit the pavement, Edmund's grandfather hit the ground, silenced by a fatal bullet. Panicked and unsure of what to do next, Edmund called his mother, who told him to contact the police. Following her instructions, he called the authorities and confessed to the murders. With nothing left to do, Edmund calmly sat on the porch and waited for the police to arrive. His emotions were numb from the reality of what he had done. During his interrogation, Edmund gave frightening explanations for his actions. When asked why he killed his grandmother, he said it was just to see what it felt like. As for his grandfather, Edmund claimed he killed him out of pity, saying he didn't want his grandfather to come home and find the body of his wife. However, authorities believed he murdered his grandparents because of his anger toward his father and feelings of rejection. Edmund was arrested and sent to the California Youth Authority for evaluation. There, psychologists discovered he had an exceptionally high IQ of 136, but they also diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. Paranoid schizophrenia is a severe mental disorder which is characterized by delusions and hallucinations, and often leading individuals to feel intensely suspicious or fearful. Those affected with this condition may struggle to distinguish between reality and their distorted perceptions. Based on these evaluations, Edmund was sent to the Atascadero State Hospital, which is a maximum security facility for mentally ill criminals. At the hospital, Edmund proved to be a quick learner. He studied psychology and became well-versed in what to say to his doctors. He even worked as an assistant to the psychologists and gained access to confidential materials on mental health and criminal behavior. This allowed him to learn how to manipulate the system. He treated his time in therapy like a classroom and mastered the art of saying all the right things at the right time. Later in his stay at Atascadero, he took another IQ test, which scored even higher at 145. Over the years, Edmund convinced his doctors that he had made incredible progress. He was described as intelligent, well-adjusted, and no longer a danger to society. One of the final reports from his probation psychiatrists read, "In my opinion, he has made an excellent response to treatment. I would see no reason to consider him a danger to himself or others. In fact, it seems reasonable to expunge his juvenile record to give him more freedom as an adult to develop his potential." But what the doctors didn't know was that Edmund was hiding his true self. Beneath his calm and cooperative exterior, he still hid dark fantasies. Edmund had become a master manipulator and played the system to his advantage, all while keeping his darkest impulses hidden from those who believed he was cured. On December 18, 1969, at just 21 years old, Ed Kemper was released from Atascadero State Hospital on parole. The doctors believed he had recovered from his psychological issues, even though they had recommended that he should not return to his mother due to their toxic relationship. Despite these warnings, Ed was sent back to live with her. By this time, Clarnell had become an administrator at the University of California in Santa Cruz. While living with his mother, Kemper attended community college to meet his parole requirements. At this time, he was unsure of his place in the world and was drifting from one job to another. Once he saved enough money, Kemper moved in with a friend in Alameda. But he still felt trapped because his mother would always call him and surprise him with visits. He often struggled financially, which led him to return to his mom's apartment frequently. In his early 20s, he met a high school student from Turlock at a Santa Cruz beach, and they got engaged in March 1973. Their engagement lasted over a year before ending when Kemper was arrested again. Her parents asked that her name not be made public, and she was reportedly 17 and still in high school at the time. In the same year, 1971, Ed found work with the California Department of Transportation. During this time, he also grew fascinated with firearms and law enforcement. He even applied to become a state trooper. But his dreams of joining the police were quickly shut down due to his massive size, and he was simply too large for the role. Still, Ed didn't let this rejection discourage him. Instead, he befriended several police officers he met at a local bar. Thanks to his friendly and charming personality, they nicknamed him Big Ed. He became a familiar face among the officers and even earned a police-issued training badge, and sometimes gained access to firearms. His ties to law enforcement helped him fit into their world, even as dark thoughts cooked beneath the surface. Later, in 1971, Ed was involved in a motorcycle accident that left him with a badly injured arm. Unable to continue working, he filed a lawsuit and won a $15,000 settlement. With this money, Ed bought himself a car, which was an investment that gave him a new sense of freedom. But along with that freedom came the return of his darkest impulses. Ed began driving around the University of California Santa Cruz campus, where his mother worked. He noticed many young women hitchhiking and tried to catch rides to and from their destinations. Watching these women sparked something inside him. The urge to act on his violent fantasies was becoming more challenging to control. He started preparing his car for something sinister. Ed placed plastic bags, knives, blankets, handcuffs, and other tools in the trunk and kept a gun hidden beneath the driving seat. Then he began picking up female hitchhikers. At first, Ed didn't act on his impulses. He used these initial encounters to practice and refine his approach. He learned how to make the young women feel comfortable around him, talked to them in a way that made them lower their guard and hide his real intentions. Despite his growing desire to harm them, the charisma and charm of Ed allowed him to gain their trust quickly. It was only a matter of time before he would strike. As days passed and more hitchhikers slipped through his grasp, the urge of Ed Kemper to act on his darkest desires grew stronger. The fantasies he had nurtured for so long were becoming unbearable. Finally, the moment came when he felt ready to take the next terrifying step. It was a quiet morning in early May in the Berkeley area when he spotted two young women, Mary Ann Pesci and Anita Lucchesa. The college students were hitchhiking and hoping to catch a ride back to the Stanford University campus. They had no idea of the danger they were walking into when they willingly climbed into the back seat of Ed's car. Mary Ann and Anita were students at Fresno State University, and like many young people of that time, hitchhiking was a common way to travel. Ed was using his friendly and approachable demeanor and seemed like just another driver offering them a lift. With calculated precision, Edmund diverted from the main road. He chose a secluded path and ensured solitude. Clearly, he had the dark intention of assaulting the girls. Once they reached the isolated area, the sinister plan Ed began to unfold. He stopped the car and handcuffed Mary Ann to the back seat and left her helpless. Anita, who realized the danger, tried to run for it. She dashed into the woods, desperately hoping to escape, but Ed was bigger and faster. He caught up to her, stabbed her multiple times, and then strangled her until she died. Covered in Anita's blood, Ed returned to the car. He lied to Mary Ann and told her he needed her help. Confused and terrified, she stepped out of the car, but Ed quickly overpowered her as well. He brutally stabbed her and left her to bleed to death in the trunk of his car next to Anita's lifeless body. With both girls dead, Ed drove back to his home, and his roommate was not at home. The horror didn't end there. He decapitated both bodies, cut off their hands, and assaulted their corpses. As if that weren't enough, he took Polaroid pictures of the mutilated bodies to keep as trophies so he could relive the horrific events whenever he wanted. Then, he bagged the remains and abandoned them near Loma Prieta Mountain. Kemper also engaged in disturbing acts with the severed heads before disposing of them. For months, the families of Mary Ann and Anita were left in agony, not even knowing what had happened to their daughters. They filed missing person reports, but there were no clear answers. It wasn't until August 1972 that part of the truth came to light. Mary Ann's severed head and some of her remains were discovered scattered in the Loma Prieta Mountains. However, Anita's body was never found. Ed had finally acted on the dark fantasies he had been hiding for years, but the satisfaction he felt was short-lived. After these brutal murders, the hunger of Ed Kemper for violence only grew stronger. The rush of control and power he felt was something he craved, and it wasn't long before he sought out his next victim. On September 14, 1972, just a few months after his last killings, Ed was on the stalk again. One warm afternoon, he spotted 15-year-old Aiko, a bright but naive young girl, waiting for a bus. Aiko missed her bus on her way to a dance class and decided to hitchhike. When Ed stopped his car, she willingly got in and was unaware of the dark fate awaiting her. Ed smoothly made conversation as they drove along the highways, and his intentions were harmless. Eventually, he pulled out a gun and pressed it against Aiko's ribs. He claimed that he had been thinking about taking his own life and just wanted someone to talk to. His manipulation worked. Aiko, trusting his words, let her calm down. Ed then convinced her to let him tie her up and put a piece of cloth into her mouth, and he was pretending it was for her own safety. He pulled over to the side of the road and secured her mouth with tape. With Aiko now restrained, he instructed her to move to the back seat of the car. Thinking the worst was over, Aiko complied, not realizing that the plan of Ed was only just beginning. In a strange moment, Ed accidentally locked himself out of the car while trying to hide the gun under the driving seat. He had to talk to Aiko to unlock the door for him. Despite being tied up, Aiko trusted Ed enough to let him back in the car.
One victim let me back in the car. I locked myself out. She opened the door for me. My gun was under the seat. What in the hell am I doing telling you that? Am I a masochist? Am I looking to be tormented further? I'm trying to show you just how awful this got, how commanding these rages got. I was raging inside. There was just...
It was an act of kindness that would soon seal her tragic fate. As soon as Ed got back inside, he wasted no time. He attacked Aiko and began strangling her. The young girl fought back with all her strength, but Ed was too strong. He overpowered her and then used her scarf to finish the job. After strangling her, Ed sexually assaulted her lifeless body and continued his sick cycle of violence. Once Aiko was dead, Ed placed her body in the trunk of his car. Despite the horrific act he had just committed, Ed felt no regret. In fact, after the struggle left him hot and sweaty, he drove to a nearby bar and casually had a few drinks as if nothing had happened. Later that night, Ed returned to his home with Aiko's body still in the trunk. There, he dismembered her, just as he had done with his previous victims. The cruelty of his actions knew no bounds, and Aiko Koo became another tragic name on a growing list of Ed Kemper victims. The mother of Koo called the police to report her daughter missing and put up hundreds of flyers asking for information. Unfortunately, she received no leads about the whereabouts of her daughter. As the cruel desires of Ed Kemper deepened, so did the horrors he imposed on his victims. His level of depravity intensified when he began experimenting with even more disturbing acts, like freezing the parts of his victims' bodies and, as he later claimed, eating them. He called it an experiment, as if that could justify his sick behavior. On a rainy evening on January 7, 1973, Ed found his next victim. Cynthia Schall, a seasoned hitchhiker, was walking along Mission Road near the university campus and was trying to catch a ride. The weather didn't stop Cynthia from getting into Ed's car. She had done it many times before with other drivers, and Ed seemed friendly enough and made her feel at ease. What Cynthia didn't know was that Ed was eager to test out his new .22 Ruger pistol, and she was his next target. After driving for a short while, Ed pulled off the road into a secluded area, far from anyone who might hear her cries for help. He forced Cynthia out of the car and, without hesitation, ended her life with a single shot to the head. Cold and calculated, Ed loaded her lifeless body into the trunk of his car. With her safely hidden away, he drove back to the house of his mother. Edmund Kemper had moved back in with his mother by then. He kept her body hidden in a closet in his room overnight. Ed had become skilled at hiding his crimes from his mother, who lived with him. The next morning, after his mother left for work, Kemper engaged in illicit acts with the corpse of Schall and removed the bullet from her body. In the privacy of his home, he committed unspeakable acts, assaulting the corpse, and then dismembering and decapitating her in the bathtub of his mother. As usual, he kept Cynthia's severed head and hid it in his room as a gruesome trophy. Later, Ed drove along the California coastline and discarded pieces of Cynthia's body along the way and scattered them in remote areas to make sure they wouldn't be easily found. But his cruelty reached a new level when he buried the head of Cynthia in the yard of his mother, right beneath her bedroom window, facing upward toward her bedroom. Ed later said he did this to symbolically mock his mother, because she always wanted people to look up to her. By this time, police were already aware of a string of missing hitchhikers and college students in the area, but they had no idea who was behind the disappearances. To complicate matters, there were two other serial killers active in the same region, John Linley Frazier and Herbert Mullen. This made the investigation even harder, as the police didn't know they were dealing with multiple killers at once. The authorities were so concerned that they issued warnings to students and advised them not to accept rides from cars without campus stickers. But this warning didn't apply to Ed. Thanks to his mother, who worked at the university, Ed had a campus sticker on his car which made him appear trustworthy to potential victims. In this way, Ed Kemper continued to blend in with society, using his charm and his unassuming appearance to hide the terrifying monster he truly was. And as long as he remained undetected, his killing spree would continue. On another rainy evening, February 5, 1973, Ed Kemper was again on the prey. He spotted two young women, Rosalind Thorpe and Allison Liu. Both were waiting for a ride near the edge of the campus. They felt safe when Ed pulled up beside them because his car displayed a campus sticker, which gave them a false sense of security. Little did they know that they were getting into the car of a notorious killer. As they drove through Santa Cruz, Ed's mood darkened. He slowed down, pulled out a hidden gun, and shot Rosalind in the head, and Allison was shot 3 times. Ed was feeling strangely calm and recounted hearing Allison's struggling breaths when he drove past campus security. Following his dark routine, Ed returned to his mother's residence with the bodies. He decapitated, dismembered, and discarded them. Meanwhile, the personal life of Ed was falling apart. He had a wild relationship with his mother, who often criticized him and their living situation. One evening, they had a heated argument that left Ed boiling with anger. Clarnell decided to leave the house to attend a party and left Ed alone with his dark thoughts. While she was away, the rage of Ed boiled over. When Clarnell returned home later that night and fell asleep, Ed saw this as his chance. In the darkness of the night, he took action, which led to a devastating change in his already troubled life. For a week, Ed Kemper had been plotting the murder of his mother. Their relationship had reached a breaking point which was filled with constant criticism and demeaning and left Ed boiling with resentment. Finally, the night came when he decided to act on his dark thoughts. As Clarnell fell asleep in her room, Ed seized the opportunity. With a hammer in hand, he crept into her room and struck her in the head again and again. The violent act was brutal and ruthless, and when it was over, he decapitated her. Ed then placed her severed head on a shelf. It was an act of frightening defiance against the woman who had tortured him for so long. In a final act of cruelty, he cut out her mother's larynx and disposed of it down the garbage disposal and justified his actions by pointing to her endless criticism. After hiding the remaining parts of her body, he thought of a friend of his mother, Sally Hallett. Ed called Sally over and pretended everything was normal. When she arrived, the calm cover-up of Ed shattered and he strangled her to death. He concealed Sally's body in a closet and wanted to ensure that his crimes would not be discovered easily. To taunt the police, he left a note that read, approximately 5:15 a.m. Saturday, no need for her to suffer anymore at the hands of this horrible, murderous butcher. It was quick asleep, the way I wanted it, not sloppy and incomplete, gents, just a lack of time. I got things to do. After leaving the note, Ed cleaned up the scene and drove away in his car. He made his way to Pueblo, Colorado, with mixed feelings of exhilaration and calm. As he drove, he listened intently to the radio and hoped to hear news about murder of his mother. However, when the report didn't mention it, Ed pulled over the car and made a crucial decision. He picked up the phone and called the Santa Cruz Police Department and confessed to both murders. At first, the officers on the other end were skeptical of his claims. But as Ed calmly and clearly recounted the details of his heinous acts, they began to take him seriously. Police officers were dispatched to his location, where they found Ed waiting by a payphone. He was looking strangely calm and composed. The shocking nature of his confession would lead to a dramatic turn in his life and mark the end of a dark chapter and the beginning of another. Edmund Kemper earned the notorious nickname Co-Ed Killer for his gruesome targeting of female college students in the Santa Cruz County area of California. His heinous crimes left a trace of horror and devastation, which often involved acts of necrophilia, decapitation, and dismemberment. The pure brutality of his actions shocked the nation and revealed the darkness of his disturbed mind. On May 7, 1973, Kemper was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. He was assigned Jim Jackson, who was the chief public defender of Santa Cruz County. Since Kemper gave a very detailed confession, his lawyer had no choice but to plead not guilty because of insanity. While in custody, Kemper even tried to take his own life twice. The trial began on October 23, 1973. As the courtroom filled with spectators and reporters, 3 court-appointed psychiatrists assessed Kemper's mental state. Dr. Thorpe also interviewed Kemper, using truth serum to ensure honesty. During these interviews, Kemper confessed to cannibalism and revealed he had cut flesh from the legs of his victims, cooked it, and eaten it in a casserole.
Well, I'm not an expert. I'm not an authority. I'm someone who has been a murderer for almost 20 years.
Can you say how many people might be doing crimes like you were doing?
It would be a guess, but it's not. It's far more than 35.
Did you like Kemper?
I like Kemper.
You were able to appear like an ordinary person, non-threatening to...
I lived as an ordinary person most of my life, even though I was living a parallel and increasingly sick life, other life.
However, Dr. Thorpe told the court that Kemper was fully aware of his actions and actually sought notoriety as a murderer. In California, the Manhattan standard was used to determine insanity defenses. This standard required clear proof that the defendant suffered from a mental disease or defect, causing them to be unaware of the nature or wrongfulness of their actions at the time of the crime. To qualify, the defendant had to either not understand what they were doing or recognize their actions, but not grasp their wrongdoing. However, Edmund Kemper seemed to know his actions were wrong, and his behavior showed signs of planning and hatred. On November 1, 1973, Kemper took the stand in his own defense. He claimed that he killed his victims to possess them fully, which suggested that 2 distinct personalities within him drove him. He described a killer personality that would take over during his violent acts and attempted to shift some blame away from him.
Incredible energies, positive and negative, depending on a mood. That would trigger one or the other. And outside, I looked troubled at times. Other times I looked moody. Other times perfectly serene.
After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. On November 8, 1973, they declared Kemper sane and guilty on all counts. The seriousness of his crimes hung over everyone in the courtroom. When the judge asked Ed what he thought his sentence should be, he calmly replied, "I should be tortured to death." However, due to a recent cancellation of capital punishment in California, Kemper was instead sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences. With a suspension of the death penalty imposed by the California Supreme Court, he received a sentence of 7 years to life for each count, all to be served concurrently. Ed Kemper was then transferred to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where he is spending the rest of his life. As the trial concluded, it became clear that the actions of Ed Kemper had left an indelible mark on society. His alarming confessions and the gruesome details of his crimes haunted the public and served as a reminder of the darkness that can remain within the human mind. Edmund Kemper is serving his life sentence at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where he is known as a model prisoner. He engages in activities like narrating audiobooks for the visually impaired and crafting ceramic cups. His willingness to participate in interviews has given valuable insights into the mind of a serial killer and influenced how law enforcement understands such offenders. Despite his good behavior, a recent psychiatric evaluation labeled him a high risk for reoffending and highlighted ongoing concerns about public safety. The parole history of Kemper shows a pattern of denials over several decades. His first eligibility in 1979 was denied, and this continued through the 1980s. In 1988, he acknowledged that society wasn't ready for him, which likely influenced his next denial. He faced additional denials in 1991, 1994, and 2007, with prosecutors emphasizing the severity of his crimes. As of 2024, he chose not to attend the scheduled hearing, and once again he was denied parole. His next eligibility date is set for 2031, but the path to release remains uncertain. By 2024, the health of Edmund Kemper had deteriorated significantly. He is now a wheelchair user following a stroke and has been diagnosed with several chronic conditions, which include diabetes and coronary heart disease. These health issues have added a new layer to his situation in prison. Moreover, a psychiatric evaluation again conducted in April 2024 classified him as being at a high risk of committing further offenses. This assessment restates the concerns that have persisted throughout his parole history and emphasizes the severity of his past and the potential risks he poses.